I think I'll give you a few minutes to let everybody in before I start. All right, welcome everybody. I will assume that we will get a few more people trickling in as we go. Welcome to the Hindsight 2021 Symposium created by the 2019-2020 cohort of Purdue Ecological Sciences and Engineering students at Purdue University. We are extremely grateful for everyone's presence here today and the time you've taken to talk about how we move forward after an eventful 2020. I would like to welcome today's panelists, which include Dr. Marcelo Korc of the Pan American Health Organization, Dr. Esteban Ramirez from the Protect Purdue Health Center, Santiago Borja, commercial airline pilot and award-winning photographer, Dr. Becca Nixon from Purdue, the former Purdue student from ESE whose research focused on the community adaptation and social and economic equity. I would like to make a few general housekeeping notes. Please, whenever possible, turn on your camera, as this makes for a more interactive panel event. In a few moments, I will let each one of our panelists give a basic introduction on their area of expertise. After this, we will transition to comments and questions from the panelists. If you have a question, please feel free to write the question in the chat area, and you may send it to everyone, or you may also send it to our moderator, Francisco Montalvo, if you like. At the very end, I will ask that you stick around as we announce the winners of our art exhibit. We will do this the last few minutes of the global panel. I think that is all of our housekeeping items. Thank you again for joining us. I would like to now welcome our panelists to introduce themselves. Please keep in mind the topic of this panel is centered on how we move forward as a society after the events of 2020 with a global health issue, political unrest, and issues surrounding social justice and climate change. How do we manage this complex problem? Dr. Korc, I'm going to now allow you a few minutes to introduce yourself and the expertise you bring to this panel.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be in this panel with all of you and to be part of this discussion on the moving forward. Not a simple question to answer, as I would say. Just to give a few statements about my background. I'm currently the unit chief on climate change and environmental determinants of health at the Pan American Health Organization, which is also the American Regional Office of the World Health Organization. And I've been with the Pan American Health Organization for over 20 years in several countries in Latin America, including Peru, Venezuela, Colombia, the US-Mexico border, in El Paso, Texas, currently in Washington, DC. For background, I'm an engineer as well. I have a PhD in chemical engineering and also a master's in public health. And it's really a pleasure being here. I really would like to then give the chance to my colleagues to also speak and move to the questions that will be the most interesting part than just talking about myself. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Esteban Ramirez.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. My name is Esteban Ramirez. I'm an internal medicine physician. I also serve as the Chief Medical Officer for Protect Purdue Health Center. I'm also a clinical assistant professor of medicine. As my role in Chief Medical Officer, I help oversee the guidance provided by our team here at Purdue University, which includes not only the case management team, who provides medical advice to our students, faculty, and staff that are either experiencing or have been affected in some way by COVID-19, but we're also overseeing the contact tracing team, which helps us to identify who may have been affected by those positive individuals. So that's a critical piece that really is important in trying to manage COVID-19, is for us to be able to get a good, strong contact tracing team set up and communicating with our individuals that are affected. Also, as my role, I serve as a liaison to our community. So I work closely with our mayors, as well as the Tippecanoe County Health Department, in order to make sure that the CDC guidances that we're following are being applied appropriately to our university, because it's a very unique environment. Also, I meet regularly with the local hospital administrators to make sure that what we are applying at our university can be supported by the local community. And lastly, I serve as a collaborator with other universities and organizations and share the learning that we're experiencing here at Purdue, and also the learning that's happening in other countries and other universities, and help us to apply that here to our environment. So I'm really excited to be part of this symposium and just learn some more, because really there's so much that's happened in the last year. And I think that this is a great opportunity to do some great sharing.
Thank you so much. All right, next we will have Santiago Borja, and I believe you're going to share some slides.
Yes, thank you, Rebecca. Just give me 1 second to share my screen. Let me see, it's right here. I'm not sure if you can see my screen now. Well, first of all, thank you, Rebecca. It's a pleasure to be here with you. It's an honor to share this meeting with all of you, indeed. As you mentioned, I am a commercial pilot. I've been flying commercially passenger aircraft for the last 10 years. I live in Quito, Ecuador, and I've been mostly flying to Europe and the United States. Flying these routes, we often fly the Caribbean, the Amazonia of Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Brazil, the rainforests. So we have a pretty strong weather over these areas, and that's why I developed this passion for photography, not just aviation photography, but also weather-related photography. I kind of specialize in storms, which is what I like the most. And I've liked that the community, this scientific community has liked these images too, because many people can see some interesting features of the images, overshooting tops, temperature inversions, etc. So I've been learning a lot about meteorology and climate throughout my career as a photographer. Recently, I've moved from passenger to cargo because of the pandemic, something quite new to me. So I would say that I've been about 6 months flying cargo-only aircraft, which is quite different from passenger aircraft. I've been learning a lot about dangerous goods, the transport of vaccines, or many other pharmaceuticals from Europe to Latin America, especially. And well, apart from that, I am also systems engineer, computing and systems engineer. Not really into that right now. That was a long time ago, but that's something else that I do from time to time. So having said that, thank you, and I'll be happy to share the meeting with all of you.
Thank you so much. Next up is Dr. Becca Nixon.
Thanks, Becca, and thanks everyone for being here this evening. I'm a postdoc with the Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant currently in the Forestry and Natural Resources Department at Purdue, but I'm going to focus my points today about work I did for my dissertation in communities in northwestern Pakistan and how they have adapted to ongoing stresses and shocks, largely around the water system, but also multiple social and ecological stressors and shocks. And I think we know from this past year, in a way, COVID was both a sudden shock for a lot of us, even though there were signs, right? It seemed like our world drastically changed very quickly, but then there were also ongoing changes and stressors that we dealt with throughout this past year. And that's just one example. I think we can learn from communities in Pakistan who have adapted to industrialization, urbanization, sudden natural disasters in a couple ways. And I just want to mention two of them from my research that I've done in these communities that we can talk about more throughout this meeting. But one is thinking about the ways that interactions across scales, the interaction of decisions and actions across scales, individuals that decisions at an individual level are going to impact your community, right? We see this in the environment and water use, but we also see this in, during this past year of mask wearing as an individual level impacting communities. We also see decisions at community scale impacting individuals. We see waste management at a policy level impacting individuals' water quality. In COVID, we see vaccine sites impacting individual access to vaccines. So that's one way I see what I learned in Pakistan kind of applying largely to how we adapt to stresses and shocks in our systems. The other thing I want to highlight, and this is nothing new, but in reflecting on my work and the way that it applies to this past year, is thinking about the ways that stressors compound with one another and that those who are already vulnerable become more so. We saw this a lot in Pakistan and access to clean water, having massive pandemic, right? So the ways that those who are already vulnerable to stressors and shocks, when you add more on top of that, those who are already vulnerable become more so impacted. So I think it has real implications for the equity when we think about our decision making in responding to any stress or shock, whether it be environmental, health, social, and in a way, all of those are really actually connected when we think about them in our system. So thinking about how we respond to them in ways that mitigate impacts across scales, in ways that allow for different groups to have the social support that they need in order to address those shocks and stressors.
Thank you. So I'm going to introduce Francisco Montalvo. He is going to be our moderator for this evening. He will be taking questions via chat if anyone has a question. And I think I have a question for Marcelo. I was going to ask you, what responsibility does PAHO have for the response to the pandemic when it comes to moving forward, especially around sort of economic and public health success, maybe more specifically with regards to climate change, or how does the PAHO play a role in this?
Thank you, and thank you for the question, Rebecca. There are different parts to your question, if I may, because there is a formal component to that particular path forward that it's given by our member states, which means pretty much all the countries. They have to do with international health regulations. And the international health regulations is the commitment of the countries that we, as the broker, custodian, and also to move forward with international health regulations with all member states, have certain tasks that we need to do on this pandemic moving forward. That being said, there is also the component, for example, currently the formal component of COVAX that many of you are aware of, that not so much in the US, but it's really the alliance by several organizations, private and public, to really have enough vaccines for the poor countries in the world that they are part of the alliance so they can access those vaccines. So that's the other formal component of that. But then there is the third component, which is really our heart and soul, which is we are a specialized agency for the UN system. And as you may be aware, that we have these two hats as being part of what they call the Inter-American system, as well as the American Office for the World Health Organization. But really what we do is really offer technical cooperation to the countries. In the particular case for moving forward, we see that the current pandemic has taught us several lessons of what really means global issues, and climate change is the global issue that we have here. I don't think overall that climate change is the only main difference, I would say, between climate change and the pandemic is the time, right? I mean, pandemics usually, they move fast. We all see it. It spreads, the media is on top of that, and therefore it rise to a point that the only thing you want to do is alone in your room and don't try to share any radio, TV, or anything, one more message. On the other hand, even though climate change is similar, because it's a long-term issue, and if we go back to probably when many of you have not even born, which is the Kyoto Protocol in the 1990s, and that was really the first protocol to really reduce and control the emissions that are attributed to climate change. And even there, I mean, we're talking nowadays almost 30 years ago. I mean, we're talking 25 years ago. The first scientific paper on climate change, you know where that came out, Rebecca? The first paper in the 1960s, 1950s, okay? So we are talking about knowing about climate change for the past 60 years. It's not a new thing, and some people are still in doubt if climate change will cause, it's associated with some impacts or negative impacts to our society and our health. So if you ask me, I think that, the pandemic gave us the preamble to really, are we ready for what's going to happen next? And what's going to happen next is that the effects of the climate change will really accelerate, that we're definitely going to see it on a more regular basis, that I think the societies have gotten sensitized about really having a global health issue and a global development issue, and that we really need to think about this different. We cannot continue thinking about this in the same way, even in the way that the solutions that we have encountered with the current pandemic, some of them good, some of them bad, some of them questioning about solidarity. I think that we need to, more than that, learn what worked, what didn't, and then use those experiences to move forward with our next biggest challenge, which is climate change, and see what is that we can do. However, I will tell you that so far, including the health component, the health dimension in climate change has been extremely difficult. Until last year, just to give you an example, until last year, the Green Climate Fund, which is the largest fund in the world for climate change, that it comes out of Korea. Korea started this fund and they really call other countries to put monies. I'm telling you that they're giving projects, grants for projects, infrastructure projects in the billions of dollars. We are not talking here about thousands, millions. We are talking here about a big project is about in the magnitude of $1 billion. So for countries that are poor, it's a lot of money. You know how many health projects or health with health dimension even they have had until last year? Zero. And finally, last year, call it coincidence, call it luck, call it perseverance, call it as you wish, with us, our team, we are able to break that and finally get funded for 2 readiness projects one in the Caribbean region and one in Argentina, and hopefully we are going now for the Indian countries. And these are very tiny readiness projects. We are talking here about $1 million projects. We are not talking here about anything that will change much in the short term, but it was a breakthrough in the sense to admit that health has a chair in the discussion of climate change. And that tells you where we are at and how much more we need to go in not only to have the chair, but to have a voice. And we still feel, and definitely I feel, that we do not have the voice you need to have. Let's face it, why climate change is important is because of people, is because of humans. People say it's about the environment. It's not really about the environment per se. It's because it's affecting people's lives. And there are 2 things that are affecting people's lives: their health and their well-being. And if we don't deal with their health and their well-being, it's exactly what we had in 2020, only much worse.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marcelo. And I think you made several really valid points. I think the overall perspective around climate change and this seemingly this new thing to some, which is global health, just kind of popped up out of nowhere in 2020. And I think it really is a wake-up call for, of course, governments, but institutions all over. And I think with that, I would like to transition to Dr. Ramirez, because as a member of the Purdue community, I have witnessed that in many ways, I think we feel like we're in a bubble here at Purdue, and things have functioned well, I believe, in terms of the management of the pandemic. And but there is always this I don't want to say disconnect, but it is not quite a public health policy, right? Especially last year, right? I felt like Purdue had a mini public health department, and somehow that kept us all safe. but maybe you can share, Dr. Ramirez, first of all, your experience. How is this managed, and how do you manage that in a way in parallel to the local government, the state government, the federal government, which as we all know, had an irregular response at best at times.
Absolutely. As you mentioned, it really takes a lot of different modalities and a lot of different areas of getting this information and support for an effort like what happened at Purdue University. We have the surrounding community, we have the local hospitals that we rely on. We also look at things like, is the leadership also able to coincide with what we're looking to do for our local governments as well, and our local health position as well. In order to make a big decision like having in-person classes during something like a pandemic, a lot of different pieces need to fall into place. And really, we were kind of a unique environment, because if you look at a lot of different stories and a lot of different research articles, you'll find that some universities didn't have a similar environment. But we had a very supportive environment where we had the local public health officer, Dr. Adler with the Tippecanoe Health Department, and the mayors of not only Lafayette, West Lafayette, but also our leadership for the local hospitals meeting with us in the Purdue University leadership team to be able to make sure that we're all seeing eye to eye on trying to carry out this sort of project. It wasn't like Purdue was pulling to the left and the community was pulling to the right. We all kind of had to come together and say, where do we want this to look like in the next year or in the next 6 months? And when we started, we were like, what is the next month going to look like, right? We don't even know if we're going to make it past 1 or 2 months. We had a good plan, but we didn't know how it was going to go. And knowing that we were able to team up with such a strong set of leadership like we did in our local community, that was critical, I think, for the success that we've seen thus far. And to add to Marcelo's question as well, I think that was a very good question about, if we look at climate change and we think about its effects on our health, that's a long-term effect that we're talking about. It's not like you can flip a switch and boom, now we're in a better place, right, tomorrow. And when you look at something like COVID, even though it feels like it's been here forever, it's only been here for a year, and we can more than likely see some sort of end in sight, right? But with climate change, this is something that we need to start working on immediately, because we're seeing those health effects. And if we change them tomorrow, we're still going to see those health effects for a while. So yeah, just very, very interesting to kind of compare and contrast these two different areas of climate change and also the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramirez. And see, as the Purdue grad students here, all we see is Protect Purdue, and it seems like the county isn't doing much and the hospitals aren't doing much, but they are. And I think for such a response, you're absolutely right. You need definitely you need a lot of support. There are questions coming up on the chat, which is wonderful. And before going on with the conversation, Dr. Suresh Rao, one of our faculty mentors for this cohort, he asked two deceptively simple questions. When does the pandemic end? And what will we do different when the next pandemic hits? And that's really open to anyone who'd like to take those wonderfully loaded questions.
I think it's one of those processes where you never really know until it's one of those things you realize in hindsight, oh, okay, that might have been where the turning point was, right? Because as you're going through it, it's hard to be able to say, oh, it's exactly at 12 o'clock today that this pandemic's going to end, right? So it's one of those things that you have to continue to follow and monitor and stay on top of the data as much as possible. But it's a very good question. I don't think we can precisely say when a pandemic is 100% over. We can just look back at the data and say, yeah, there is the definite downturn where there were less infections, there were less change to our local ordinances and protocols and policies from this infection, and likely that is when we start seeing those sort of changes.
Thank you very much. Yeah, definitely not easy to
Right.
answer. Somehow Purdue managed with a lot of support of the community to continue open and to function, as Dr. Ramirez said, with a lot of parameters and a lot of things that had to be in place. Other universities weren't so lucky. Other institutions weren't so lucky, and parts of the economy worldwide. One of the things that was mostly visibly affected was, of course, air travel. Both the reason why we have vaccines now and the culprit for spreading the virus all over. And I want to take this back to Santiago and maybe give us your unique perspective on how you saw this change, this effect at the beginning, and how you see it now. I was fascinated to hear that you've switched, you've adapted to become a cargo pilot, and it is not the first time I've heard this about airline pilots. Obviously, our needs for goods are not going anywhere. Our needs for business and leisure travel, of course, are limited. How do you see that effect versus what's going to happen next? Do you see the trends going upward, going down? What's your perspective?
Thank you, Francisco. Well, indeed, I see that the aviation industry has been one of the most affected industries, mainly because it grows so rapidly over time, and all of a sudden, overnight you have to shut down all commercial passenger operations. So this is something that really the industry has never seen before, not even on 9/11, which was known to be something specific. It wasn't thought that it would last a long time, the shutdown, I mean. But here I remember that at first we thought it was going to last a few months. Nobody thought it would last more than a year. So we were behind what was happening, and it took us a lot of time to catch up and realize the real magnitude of this pandemic. As you mentioned, I'm one of the lucky ones that were able to move to cargo operations. It is not that simple because of many complexities and technicalities of aviation, but there are many things that were just a matter of luck. For example, how you move pilots from one country to the other. How did you train them? How do you train the differences from this aircraft that is cargo only, which is not the same as passenger only aircraft? So we were able to manage that for a few people. A lot of people that were flying other aircraft, smaller aircraft that don't have a similar type as cargo, were unable to do this, to switch to these operations. The industry had a few things that were kind of invented, as we found out what was going on. For example, passenger aircraft were adapted to move cargo, which is something that I don't think anyone had thought about before. Before, it was thought to be economically unfeasible, too expensive. But since about 60% of cargo was being moved on passenger aircraft, this is before the pandemic, all of a sudden you have this 60% deficit of aircraft. So it had, obviously, cargo prices went up, and all of a sudden this type of operation was feasible, and I think everybody went on to do this. But I can tell you that now this is changing month by month. So a few minutes ago, I was talking to my boss, and we were discussing how's the next month going to look. And we have no idea in 2 months from now what we're going to do. If we're going to move some passengers, we're going to stick with cargo. We believe that in about 3 years, not less, we may have 2019 or 2020 numbers, before the pandemic, talking about passenger operations. But for example, we are seeing shutdowns happening again, and operations going back down again. So I cannot tell you that this is something certain. This is changing month by month.
That seems to be the name of the game here. We got a question from a student actually for Santiago, which is a really interesting one. Not all airline pilots happen to be professional photographers. Were there any noticeable trends in your photography as a pilot that connected the pandemic and climate change? And how could we learn from those trends?
What can I say? Well, the pandemic changed my photography completely. I mean, all of a sudden I was flying. Well, first I was flying empty aircraft, which was something quite different for me, and I began to do a little about that, not too much. I'm not really good at photographing anything other than storms and weather. But I would say that what I like about the photography that I do is that, from the cockpit of an aircraft, you quite don't see much of the cities, of the humans down there. You kind of see the big picture, the planet, the big weather phenomenon going on. So it's kind of a reminder of like what Marcelo said, we have to think about the big picture, what's going to happen with the planet long term, and how difficult it will be to go back on what we have already done. Like Esteban said a while ago, it's not like you can flip a switch and turn back. The effects of the pandemic, of a pandemic or of climate change, won't turn back so fast. So if we don't act now, we're going to see a lot of it in the future.
Thank you, Santiago. Appreciate it. We have a really good question for Dr. Becca Nixon. How does your work in Pakistan inform communities can or cannot adapt to compounding stressors of health, climate change, and social inequalities? Do you see connections there?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Taylor. I definitely do see connections for how communities can or should adapt. Those are two different questions, I think, can and should. But I think when I reflect on work in Pakistan about how adaptation is happening, whether it can or should happen, is that adaptation strategies that align with values of community members are going to be most well received and readily employed adaptation strategies, right? So a lot of times we see in development work kind of the prescription of certain strategies that might indeed be really well suited to environmental or economic conditions of an area, but we know that humans are complex beings. If anything, this past year has shown us that, right? Who make decisions based on a whole host of factors. So, for example, if an adaptation strategy requires someone in Pakistan to leave their family to migrate, for example, that's going to be a really big sacrifice or risk for them because of some of the values that are held in some of those families. So while that might be very appropriate in other cases as an adaptation strategy to climate change and other stressors, it might not be well suited for that area. And as far as how they should, other ways that they should or can, again, I think that idea that I mentioned earlier of these interactions across different scales or even across different groups, one thing might be really well suited for one group of individuals, but have really devastating impacts on another. For example, hydropower development in Pakistan in some of our study areas was really great for power supply to a neighboring community, but devastating to the fisheries and irrigation on which that would have diverted a lot of the water supply from those livelihood strategies. So again, it's hard to find a solution that has benefits across all groups. So when we can't find that type of solution, we do need to put those supports and compensations, right, to mitigate some of those negative impacts. And sometimes when I think about these problems, they seem so complex, right? But I think that's why we need a diversity of voices in the room to bring up these impacts, so that then we can address it. Because when we're just listening to one voice, we might not hear about the impacts for another group of people or another location. So if I had one recommendation, it's bringing a diversity of voices in so that you can hear about unintended consequences for different groups of people.
That sounds great. Thank you very much, Becca. And I think you took care of the last question there, because one of the questions was, how would you counsel a multilateral organization such as PAHO on adaptations you found that could be applied globally? And it seems like, making sure all voices are heard, that's a big one. Anything else you would like to add?
The only thing I would add, based on the conversations we've had about this, the way that the past year has brought global health into the climate change conversation, is again bringing in those voices, because I think a lot of the voices on the ground that I listened to in Pakistan were making these connections already. They see the impacts on their health from water quality and quantity issues related to climate change. So yeah, I would reiterate, sometimes I think we as academics or researchers, myself included, are really slow to make these connections, but sometimes people on the ground with these lived experiences have really already made the ties. So just an encouragement for myself included to listen to those at the front lines of some of these stressors can really guide us in what we need to address.
Thanks, Becca. Certainly, this kind of complex problems require both researchers and practitioners to work together. I think now it's more evident than ever. We have another question for anyone in the panel. Has the pandemic resulted in any beneficial changes for the people work and or the systems you work with, and you hope will be permanent changes? Yep, and anybody?
I think one thing that comes to mind, at least for me, from the health aspect, is just the amazing speed with which we were able to come up with a vaccine. That's phenomenal. Now, whether it's always going to be this fast, I can't say that. But I think we learned that we can overlap processes that perhaps before we used to not do in the fashion that we did it this time around. And we can come up with very effective methods to test a vaccine out. And I think that's very eye-opening for all, at how fast we were able to do that. Normally it takes years to get a vaccine up and running and produced appropriately. And this was able to be done so quickly in less than a year. So I think that's something that I suspect will have some permanent changes on how we do vaccine development in the future.
Francisco, yeah, Francisco, if you allow me, just complement to what Esteban was mentioning. I think that this past year also, imagine this, take one country only, United States, how much United States invested from the government public funds in 1 year due to the pandemic. 2 packages of about, $3 to $4 trillion, right? Have we ever thought if we really invested that with public funds to climate change? And with that, we did that in 1 year. And the country, I'm saying the country because that's the one we know. I mean, and we can talk about worldwide. It's very interesting, the issue of how we perceive all these situations, short-term versus long-term, what brings different issues, and how we can really, we always say that there's no money and no funds that can be put for climate change and changing the energy and changing behaviors and changing technology. But we were able to come out with $4 trillion in 1 year because we were under a direct threat. We will have another $4 trillion to invest in climate change.
Thank you, Marcelo. That's a great point. And how do we make those changes when people don't see climate change as a priority, or even as a reality, for that matter? So yeah, that's an excellent point, and I think it has also to do with visible versus invisible enemies, and also timescales, right?
And I will add one more. I think that the pandemic, in a way, I will call it, is a simple example of a much more complex issue that's climate change. And why simple? Because we do know that like Esteban was saying, the vaccine is the main solution we have. And the global pharmaceutical industry has been able to produce that particular intervention very fast and very speedy, because there are a tremendous amount of legal issues behind it and market-driven drivers. There are many market drivers that they allow that to happen, okay? The market and economic drivers of climate change are very different. They are very complex. They are direct and indirect. Many people do benefit from climate change. Many countries, they will transform their deserts in agricultural lands. You know, we do know that many countries do not see this as a problem, because all of a sudden, desert lands, they will become productive lands. Therefore, not everybody's pushing the train in the same direction. So I would say the pandemic, it was a good preamble, but sometimes a very simple preamble of a much more complex problem, human problem, societal and development problems such as climate change, that has many drivers that they all not drive in the same direction to everyone.
I think another, if I could add a little more to Marcelo's point, I think the acuity of something like a pandemic kind of just brought attention to the matter at hand, versus I think climate change, it's, even though it's been going on, as you mentioned, for quite some time, we don't feel it today as much. And so I think it's harder to be able to get people to get on board with the idea that we need to do something about this. It's sort of like, you know, boiling a pot of water. And, you know, I think I heard some analogy that if you put a frog in a pot of water and boil it slowly, the frog won't jump if you do it slow enough, right? But if you put it, if the water's already boiling, you put the frog in there, boom, they're going to jump right out. Well, the same sort of thing. The acuity of this sort of pandemic caused us to change now. Something had to happen now, versus climate change. It seems like that's that sort of slow boil effect that I think we're seeing. We're just not seeing that acute change yet. But I know it's coming. It's going to happen, and we are seeing it already. The health changes, but I think people don't. It doesn't click in a lot of people's minds as being acute.
Yep, that's you know, it's a big part of it is about perspective, and you know, what you see and what organizations perceive as urgent. And we have another questions on that end. The effects of and the different styles of leadership are clear in finding solutions to any problem. Given the diverse socio-political climates around the globe, do you see an objective way to effectively implement policies and solutions to global issues beyond the bounds of imposed by leadership? Also, not a very easy question.
Maybe Edwin can answer. He puts a question, you know, I mean, it's like.
I don't know if we would be here if we had that answer, but it's an interesting thought, though.
We'll open it to the floor. I think PAHO is one of those unique organizations that has to deal both with scientific knowledge and policy on a, I wouldn't say daily, but maybe hourly basis. So maybe Marcelo, you can at least tell us what your experience with that is.
Well, that's why I want Edwin to answer so I can get good advice. It's we are going. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, for the 20 years that I've been over 20 years in PACO, and we have been going through different trends and movements globally, regionally. One thing is for sure, the world we're living today, due to many variables, and I think that Becca also mentioned that as well, and that the community, sometimes you can really see it and that you can really perceive it. And I totally agree with that. I think that the pulse that the community gives you many times, if we would have heard more the community in the United States, probably what happened the last 4 years in the United States may not have happened. But previous administrations, they forgot to listen certain communities. They did not listen. And I think that the listening component, and I'm really trying to connect that leadership with the listening component. And I tell you, if you allow me just one example, I was asking my daughter the other day, what does she see as the difference in social media now? And she's 17, 18, and we come out with the conclusion that people are forgetting to be good, active listeners. We all like to have the megaphone, and nobody wants to listen. We all feel that we becoming an activist, and that I connect even with college. And the reason for that is because I'm learning all this college process for her now. And it's important to be an activist in college. The question I told her, maybe she should create the Active Listener Association in college, right? Because it's good to create and that has divided us. It's good to be an activist, but I think that the word of activism has really deformed to certain issues in leadership that we forgot about the component of really try to understand, to really truly listen the other person. And if you ask me about leadership, I think it focuses on the same thing globally. Countries do not listen. They all try to focus on where they want to get, but they don't listen. Not only that, we forgot that 65, 70 years ago, we had the Second World War. That created in 1948 the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Who led that Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Eleanor Roosevelt. The United States, through Eleanor Roosevelt, had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Wow. Is there anything else we can say about that?
Yeah, nothing really to add. I think it's incredible how history sometimes wants to repeat itself, right? And I think part of it is that kind of introspective view or lack of. There's and we're switching gears a little bit here, and I think part of listening is to looking at other fields, other ways of expression. And I think this year's symposium has been unique, not only because we're on Zoom, but also because we had an art exhibition. And one of the earlier questions that we didn't get to was how, I know Santiago especially has this unique dual role. How do you think we can use art to help us reflect on the changes like the pandemic? Maybe it's actually a question for all the panelists, and whether you think we could use art or other forms of expression that are not so obvious and would maybe help us to listen, as Marcelo say, that we could use to learn about the many events on 2020.
Absolutely, Francisco. And I think that art has a big role. Speaking about what I do, which is photography, I believe that to to act on something, and we are talking about climate change, you first have to understand it. You first have to acknowledge it. And I believe that a big problem is that many of us don't really understand many key things about our planet, about our environment, about how we are connected one country to the other. What happens in North America affects Europe, affects Latin America. What happens in Asia, goes around the world towards where we are. And we don't really understand. And I know the planet and the scientifics of it are very complex. But for example, through photography, I have learned a lot. And I have also seen that many people around me have learned a lot the environment. So I show them a picture of a thunderstorm, just to give you a quick example. And then we start discussing about the weather. Oh, what's that? Oh, that's another shooting top. What is that? Oh, you see the tropopause, this is how a storm develops. Oh, great. And well, when you fly, what is this? Oh, that's a jet stream, for example. What is a jet stream? It divides polar air versus tropical air. And you know that by climate change, it's moving differently. And now you can see in a more real way what's going on. Climate change isn't just something on the TV. Now you can see how it happens. You can see how it affects a specific flight you are making on a weekly or monthly basis. So it's more real to you. It's more down to the ground. So I think that through photography or all other different forms of art, we can help everybody see, and we can help everybody understand what is really going on and what is really happening now. So we don't have to wait until something bigger or more drastic happens, but we can see how it's happening right now.
That's a great perspective, Santiago. It's I think they're really both a privilege position, but in a way the responsibility for communicating that, because not all of us sit at 30 or 40,000 feet every day and we get to see this thing. So I'm personally very grateful that you actually have been able to combine your two passions, your two careers in that way. I think that's we certainly need more of that. Marcelo, Becca, Esteban, can we combine art with research and public health and climate change and the UN system to help with these bigger issues?
I think it's important for us to remember our history. As the saying goes, we're doomed to repeat the past mistakes, right? If we don't remember our history. And I think art is a very universal way to capture what are we feeling? What did 2020 feel like to us? And being able to capture that, I think in art would be amazing. Doesn't require words, so it reaches out to folks who even, may not be able to read. That's okay, but they can feel what that art might convey. And I think for us to be able to capture that and carry that on, so that when our children are, when we talk to our children about something about the pandemic of 2020, 2019, they can look at a picture like that and say, wow, that you guys went through that. And I think if we don't have something to remind us of what it felt like to go through these changes, these restrictions that we had to do in order for us to come through at the other end in a safe way, I think we're doomed again to make the same mistakes. I think we have to remember what we learned from this, the communication, international communication amongst the science community, amongst all the different community learning that was going on, vaccine learning that was going on, research findings, all that, and being able to convey it back and forth across the world was super important for our safety and our health as humans. And so I think art can capture that to some extent. And I think it would be a very worthwhile effort to do so.
That's a great point. Thank you very much, Dr. Ramirez. Anybody else want to add anything from the panelists or the participants? with art. We really wanted to take a minute to circle back to our art exhibition. We got some really great exponents of exactly what Dr. Ramirez was saying. How can we capture all these crazy feelings and experiences that are so vivid right now that won't be in 5 years or 1 year. So it's really an important task, I would say, to as a society as a whole, to be able to preserve those effects, right? With all the media and all the tools we have available nowadays. So I don't know who in my colleague would like to take on the art exhibit piece, but you guys could go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to present the winners of our art exhibition, but I just want to take a moment to thank Santiago, Becca, Dr. Ramirez, as well as Amy Ledman and some former ESE chairs who all served as judges for our art contest. And we had both a judging panel where they judged the artwork on the relevance to our symposium topic, as well as artistic elements like composition, aesthetic, etc. And we also had a popular vote online where anyone could vote for their favorite pieces from the exhibition. And we had a clear winner of both the popular vote and the judging competition, and that was ESE's own Samira Safai. And I'd just like to share her artwork if I can at this time. Yes. So if everyone can see that, Samira won for her piece called The Unity, and it's Farsi calligraphy of this very impactful poem. And our runner-up from the judging competition was actually this one next to her called Organized Chaos by Desiree Brown. And third place from the judging competition was this graphic here, Do Now, Do Together. And for our popular vote, the second place was this photograph, Silver Lining Moments. And third place was Astronaut in the Ocean. So I just want to say congratulations to Samira and the rest of our submissions, our winners, and a big thank you to our submissions. We're really excited to have some participation in the creative expression realm. And with that, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone for supporting our first virtual ESE symposium this year. I think it was a big success. And we as ESE cohort would love to thank Linda Lee and Suresh Rao, who are our faculty mentors and have guided us through this entire process, and as well as our first year colloquium class. So I just want to open it up to them if they do have any closing thoughts for Hindsight 2021.
So this is Linda Lee, and closing thoughts, well, that's a hard one. I think you guys did a great job and are a good example and good set of mentors for showing other students that you can work around challenges, and they were multiple. And I think that a lot of things that the speakers have shared have captured some of the discussions that you guys have had, and actually the new cohort has been having, along these lines of, what did 2020 reveal to us? And so one thing it reveals to us, which is one of our hallmarks in ESE, is resilience. We are resilient in spite of these challenges. And, maybe the biggest thing that, sometimes concerns me is, well, how much longer do we have to be resilient for this one challenge? Can we, when can we, we all want it to be over already, but we're patiently prodding through. And I'm sure in, a year from now, we can reflect back and say, wow, we made it through, with hopefully minimal, long-term damage. And as some of you guys pointed out, when you are now thinking about climate change and just the reality of this pandemic was different because it was very easy to feel it and globally feel it. And all people became one people because we're all suffering, in different ways, different magnitudes. So not taking away the fact that our, lower income and people that didn't have access were definitely suffering more. But even high level academics that might have been secure in their little bubble suffered because all the things we took for granted in terms of conversations in the hallway, oh, let's just talk about this over coffee, or even when you don't even have the same research areas, but all of a sudden you have these intersecting conversations inadvertently, we have totally underestimated the power of that and where that takes us. And, that gets back to the mental health stress. So I'm really impressed with the cohort, really, continually impressed by the ESE students and the way that you guys think broader and engaging people outside of the community to bring people in. So thank you very much. And thank you for the panel that shared tonight and took from your time. And we were a little low on numbers, I'm pretty sure, because wouldn't you know that Purdue internet went down at about 4:45. And when I left Purdue at 5:15, so I could get to an internet, it was still down. So that I think really impacted our participation today tonight. So because I know there was a lot more people I expected. You try to get on, internet's acting up and you give up, right? So thank you for all of those of you that stayed the course. Suresh, would you like to say something? Turn your video on if you have that option. He's there. I just talked to him.
How many times do you say you're on mute? I muted myself. Hello, thank you first to the panel for agreeing to be on this late session to close this year's symposium. Given the extraordinary conditions, the students have done really, really well. So I want to compliment them for organizing this despite all the issues that they had confronted. And so the panel knows these students serving as leaders for this year's symposium, as in all cohorts a decade or more before them, do all of this on their own. Linda and I serve to start the process and give them a few suggestions. And every year we stand back and watch them grow and perform and come through. So to find you very diverse group of well-known, qualified members to be on panel, to be speakers, etc., it's tremendous. Every year they do this and we just watch them with amazement. So compliments to the group of students who've done it. The second, I guess, is that I'm a highly optimistic person in my personal life, but when I teach in ESE every year, I seem to come across as a highly pessimistic person because I'm trying to I'm known as a doomsday professor sometimes, because I'm talking about many existential crises that we face, but neglect to act on them collectively as a society. So I'm trying to get to these people, these students, much younger than I am, to say that we screwed up the world and you guys need to fix it. So let's see how we can work it out, given the wisdom of how we messed it up, and see how you can fix it, something of that order. The pandemic, however, has been the greatest challenge in the last century for all countries across the world. And as Esteban said, the science that turned so quickly to produce the vaccines and tested and distributed, it's an extraordinary thing to watch what science can do to help public health and public policy and so on. If only the leaders went along. So we can do the best science, but you can't necessarily get to the public. And if only the public didn't have the hesitancy about a very good solution that would save most of us. So to me, these two are really outside what we normally think of in academia. So that's been a big lesson for me. The question I asked was, when does a pandemic end? Has been a recurring theme in previous years. I used World War II in previous cases as an example. When did the war end? When did Vietnam War end? Wars. When do they end? And I think the answer is they don't, because their impacts cascade through generations. 500,000 Americans who died, and much more so across the world, leave a legacy of impacts through our societies and are at the personal level to families, immediate families, but also to us. These gaps in our society will leave cascading impacts for generations. In the same way, the innovations that have come in place, will they be adopted and kept? I think Esteban, I asked whether or not Purdue has learned enough, just a very small scale, to keep the good behavior, good habits, good practices, or do we forget it so soon and return to Miami Beach parties, you know? So I think I worry about that a lot, about adaptations not being maintained to maintain resilience and safety and security. They don't seem to last. And last comment, so just when we think we're resilient and we've adapted and we've learned how to do this, something else comes along next, some other form of a major disaster. And today we talked about climate change as the one that's coming. Well, it's been coming for 70 years, as was pointed out. And we've been feeling the effects every year, more and more and more. So when does the society and the leadership that we elect converge to say, we're going to do something about it, right? And is it too late? So this is the doomsday professor. Is it too late to say, okay, finally we agreed to do something, but perhaps it isn't. No, maybe it's too late. So I hope it's not, and I hope we reach consensus soon. And I hope, most importantly, these students who are going forward and then other ESE students to come are the ones who will change the world. I think it's too late for me. So thank you very much. And I'm glad to have been part of this. Linda, I think
Thank you very much, Linda Siraj, for your kind words. And once again, thank you to all the panelists, and big thanks to my cohort mates and everybody who did a tremendous effort to put this all together. We're done. Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
See you all. Bye.